I think that leads us to move on to talking to Stefanie. I'm going to share my screen to introduce Stefanie. Now, Stefanie and I got to know each other a little bit better when we ran a conference together at the University of Sunshine Coast in May this year, called Common Ground, where we were trying to make a space for all the conservationists in Southeast Queensland to get together, not just wildlife conservationists, but also industry people, developers, policymakers, so that we could identify the areas that needed to be focused on for our region as we approach the 2032 Olympics, which will, for those of you who don't know, will be held in Brisbane. So it's a pressure point, and it's also a point where we have the ability to have international notice. So we wanted to make sure that everyone's heading the same direction. And it was a very successful one-day conference. So it was lovely to meet you, Stefanie, at that and learn a little bit more about what you're doing. Since then, I've seen you give a talk to the Sunshine Coast Council, which was absolutely fascinating. And thank you very much for agreeing to come and talk to us today about multi-species justice and how considering animals in our justice system leads to a better future for all of us. I think it's a really good segue from what Wong was talking about with Kalimantan and development and greed. So I'll hand over to you, Stefanie, and thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for the invite. I'm happy to be here. I'd like to say too, if we keep the sun bear kind of close to our heart, that can be a good example for us to think through how justice might work for the sun bear, and especially with those of you who've worked with endangered species. I think I'm really interested to hear, like your ideas. I've got a short presentation where I've just put some thoughts together about justice, and then I picked a couple of my favorite examples, because what I'm doing with this group at Sydney Uni and elsewhere is we're trying to institutionalize multi-species justice. And the question of how to do that, you have to start with what justice is. And then you need to think about the ways in which you could incorporate these ideas in practical ways into the institutions that we have. And then we also like to think about blue sky thinking, like what would we do if we could do anything to make the planet a fair place for all species. And in a moment, when we get done, I'll share the couple of books that I've used. I've already put the links up to the 2 examples that I put up there, because partly I'm here because Sarah wanted me to talk about a friend of mine who's talking to whales currently. So I'm going to frame that.
Yeah, it's very cool stuff.
Very cool. So one of the things to talk about really quickly for those who aren't familiar is justice is a very profoundly human concept for the most part. Our kind of famous Western theorist of justice, John Rawls, said that animals could be included in his theory, but that wasn't his job. So he kind of leaves that to the side and talks about certain kind of justice, which is about fairness. So justice is fairness is often what people talk about, that we have justice in the world if things are fair for everyone. But I think we can group it into these 4 main theories. And it's partly interesting to think about it in a multi-species setting, because it can have very different practical contexts that can fit into a lot of what we're talking about here. When we were listening to you talk about the sun bear, think about how, how do we determine who gets what? How do we determine how fairly people are treated? How do we punish people? A lot of times we think about justice as only punishment. People are kind of used to thinking of the justice system as something that metes out punishment, but it is actually wider than that. It can be restorative. So I think a lot of the work with multi-species tends to interact with restorative, because we want to restore our relationships to a rightness. So there's overlaps, but at the same time, is justice only for humans? And in part, this is a difficult question to answer when we think about the Earth system and all its living components, because justice tends to be on our own lifetime. Right? We don't think about justice in deep time for the Earth. What might it mean to be just to a river or a mountain is quite different than what it might mean to be just to a shrew or a tree, or other species that have much different lifetimes and timeframes. And I thought I would open this up for people to think through too. Can you imagine as we finish this and we talk at the end, could justice work for the sun bear? If we were put into a situation in the human political situation we have, how could we talk about the sun bear as someone who is about justice? So I guess one of the things then, if we move from thinking about the context in which we discuss human justice, who gets what, is it fair what they're getting, all of those questions we have that we know we already don't answer well, right? And we know that other species often take the hit for our injustices, and that in fact injustices in the natural world are reflected back and forth, especially during colonization. So how do we begin to think about how we expand that justice outward to include the well-being of lots of other living beings and living systems and even non-living systems, right? How do we my good friend Christine Winter, who's part of this project, does work on sand, and you'd be amazed at how many relationships in Aotearoa come from sand, and what it means to look at sand. There's sometimes there are things we don't think about, and we don't think as much about what can be what these species give to us, but how might we help them flourish within our justice system and within other relational systems? That's a question. I think it's one of the ones, if we're sitting in the middle of a heat wave in Queensland and snowstorms in the northern hemisphere, how do we answer these in a time of climate crisis, and a time of very in many ways novel colonial movement murder, and how do we address them? So I wanted to talk about some of the principles where it gets very complicated and how we want to rethink this. And this is justice tends to, and oftentimes humans become very exceptional. They believe in their own species being special. And one of the things we could stop and say, well, if we share this planet with 8 million other species and many more and counting, many more we're losing, how is it that we put them as a justice bearer too, right? How do they hold rights? And I'll talk about that a little more in context later, but just think about that. Like how do we think about justice for the sun bear? Who talks for the sun bear? How would we interact with our human systems to find some kind of justice for the sun bear in the situation that they found themselves in through human destruction of habitat and the violences around them? It also has to do with relationality. And the thing about relationality that becomes, I think, tricky is it's really easy to see how we're connected, but what are we supposed to do from that? Right. And I think many of us know, and I think the joke about how every family is a socialist family because it's from each according to his ability to each according to his need, right? When we're in our families, we know that everyone works for the family, but not everyone puts the same things into it. So we know that we have shared lives and responsibilities at all levels. It doesn't always match the way our economy works more broadly. We may have different ideas of how we work together and how we are interconnected. And how do we base justice on that? In one group that I'm working with Sarah Hurd about the multi-species constitution, one of the things we're thinking about in that is if we make an overarching constitution, it should be about when do humans disrupt flows? When do they move into ecosystems and change them? Maybe that's the way we begin to look at coming back to a more ecological sense. When do we disrupt it and how do we restore that? In some cases, things can't be restored, and then what do we do, right? Once we've chopped down the forest, once we've chopped down the elephant's home, what do we do, right? Those are difficult questions. Also, we need to remember multi-species justice has to acknowledge that we need to value things not because of what they become for us. So trees are beings that are of value, not because we rely on forest products in most parts of our economy, not just for what we provide humans. So much of environmentalism, as we move, I think, through into the 21st century, begins to think more about deep ecology, begins to think about more about indigenous beliefs and the kind of radical ways in which we're entangled. And that has value, not just because it does something for us. And I think most importantly, and the last of the principles here is that we have to talk about systemic transformation. So in my work, most recently in the book Ecology Politic with my co-author Anthony Burke, we spend a lot of time thinking about the way in which we can't solve
Dropping there,
problems
Steph.
first, because if we do that, we don't have a planet left. And how do we? So we've got systemic transformation that's important, that has to do with the way in which colonialism and capitalism and endo-colonialism have affected natural systems. All right, so I'll take a minute to take a breath and kind of come through. We've talked about human justice. We've talked about the ways in which multi-species justice wants to try to correct and radically reimagine the way in which we think of our relationality through fairness, through redistribution, through all of the things that we want for human communities. How do we begin to transfer that to the wider community of other species on the planet? Any questions or comments or points before I head into the second piece of this? Is there anything in the chat?
One very, very small comment is that when you look this way and broaden our thinking, it makes you feel how narrow our perspective has been as humans, right?
Yeah, it has. And I've been thinking a lot about how we are indeed exceptional beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and cosmically, I think we're exceptional, right? We live on this beautiful blue-green gem in this expanding universe. But how do we take that exceptionality and not use it hubristically? We kind of bounce back and forth between those two things a lot. We're very exceptional, but at the same time, on this planet, do we actually have the right to use it up? Right? Are 100 rich people, is this their resort and the rest of us are staff and amusement? Like, how is it that we want to rethink our larger political and economic issues? So we have to talk about the dominance of humans, I think. And another really important point is if we move beyond the charity and damage, and I'll talk about Ecocide briefly, it helps ground this, but it's not just about rewarding damages or protecting something. It's actually about giving these species and beings legal rights in which they have their own subjectivity. And we have to learn how to speak with them and along with them. So this, of course, means lots of people in on it, right? We need scientists, we need traditional landholders. And speaking of, I'm on the Ngunnawal land here. I forgot to acknowledge that I was somewhere other than Sunny Coast. So we've got to think about those things, because Indigenous science and philosophy can help correct historical violences, as well as we don't need to reinvent the wheel on much of this, right? It's already there. It's already been a part of traditional knowledges. And I think in Europe, that's also part of many European traditional knowledges that have gotten forgotten through the economic and political systems that we have. So practical application is very important, right? It's a ticking clock, really. So here, the last little piece, I just want to talk about some examples that help. If you can see how justice, if we talk about how contextual justice is and how it can flex and think in different ways, if we think about specific examples, I think that helps us ground ourselves in how we might become a more just world. An important one is ecocide, and this would create the destruction of nature in a time of war as the fifth crime of war, which would make it punishable by law. It is the case that the environment and animals do have some protection during wartime under the Geneva Conventions. You're not allowed to destroy or salt the land. These are often really old things that come from historical laws around not destroying farmland. You can't kill livestock. You can't take away a civilian's right to have, but this is something that takes it to another level where we would say something like the bombing of the Russian bombing of the nuclear power plant could be seen as a crime of war, different from another kind of crime, if that were to cause major environmental damage. We've got the constitutional protection through Pachamama and the Ecuadorian, which has been under attack but is sticking and is holding. And definitely we see a lot of amazing ways of thinking, and as well as the increased violence against people who are environmental defenders in those regions. So that's a really important piece of it, is how do we protect it through our own constitutions? How do we protect it internationally and domestically? Our Environmental Protection Act does protect the environment as matters. But in that way, we can see how we need to maybe talk about specific things. So for my last two examples, I thought I would bring some fun stuff to your attention. One of which is someone that I know from my multi-species project that I've been working on for the last 3 years with the Berggruen Institute and various scholars and activists and artists. And he's working in the Dominican Republic with a pod of sperm whales and using AI. We can all agree that AI may suck in all kinds of places, but in this case, this large language model has been chatting with whales, which bouncing things back and forth. And they've found that whales have created diphthongs, which are the combination of vowels. So beginning to understand that whales have a complex language, and we might potentially be able to talk to them. I've got a slide for that in a moment. And then the other one that I just absolutely made me so happy this week is the legal subjectivity for the stingless bee in Peru. 2 municipalities have them. So I think these are a good bit of examples around how we and to really institutionalize how other things than these bees, the stingless bees, who are of course important pollinators, sharers of honey, they now have in 2 municipalities, and they're hoping it's going to go to the full nation, the right to exist and thrive, have a healthy population, ecologically stable climatic conditions, and can be legally represented if they've been harmed. And
that is amazing.
It is. It just really makes me feel really good to know that. And that in fact, the indigenous folks there have long-term relationships with them, very close relationship with the bees. So I think it's really, really amazing to think about the way in which at the IPCC, at the international level, the constant advice is we have to give land back to the indigenous people. 30 by 30, sure. Some of those bigger, but what happens if you give land back to indigenous stewardship is things like this, right? So that's and we improve the life of humans, we improve the life of the things that are important to them around them, all through these ways of making the world fair for all of us. And then Project CETI with David Gruber. I think whales are interesting, and I was reminded of this as I was looking through some of their press on the website, catching up, that the whales and the whale, I remember this when I was a kid, right? In the 70s, we were still talking about whales. They sang whale song, and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which has been pretty effective, and also has really made people question large-scale whaling, especially in the United States. What would happen if we could talk to them? Yeah. I worry sometimes in my darker hours that it wouldn't matter what they said. But in my lighter hours, I think maybe by oftentimes the animal rights movements of the past have relied on sentience, and I think that's we've intelligence in animals. How other languages and other intelligences might be just as important. And I think my latest tuition has a double meaning, right? If we think about how we are constituted, and my work throughout kind of my dissertation and now has been at the microbial and at the viral And so I use the way in which we think about bodies as not all human. We're not very human. And we have a lot of commensal relationships in our guts and on our skin and in our mouths. And if we think about how we're already party to a constitution, to a contract that includes multi-species others, bacteria in our guts that 70% of our carbs wouldn't get digested without them. We owe a lot to the beings around us. So that is our constitution. So how do we write it in a human way that begins to honor this thing that's already written in heat and energy and gravity and atmosphere and water and forests? Like, the most special thing on our planet is water and trees. They aren't anywhere else, nor are humans. So why have we decided to be at the top of this chain cosmically? Again, it helps us question our exceptionalism. So I hope that gives you a little taste of how we're trying to think through multi-species justice practically, as well as using it as a space in which we can dream and imagine, and also correct the rights and the wrongs that we've had, the taking away of land and the colonization of much of the world during the past century. Caring for everyone makes us care for ourselves better, ultimately. Thank
That
you
was
so much.
amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, I loved the way that you've sort of framed this idea of a constitution, and that our whole body is basically a community, and that just to extend that idea out further to include our entire species community around us is not such a big stretch once you think of yourself as a community.
Yeah, you're nested, right? You're nested and you see you're nesting in other places, and I think it allows us to see the ways in which um we owe each other and we owe other beings so much.
Mm. I absolutely do. Thank you so much. I hope everyone enjoyed that as much as I do. We do have one question from George, and I think, George, you put this on the chat just before Stefanie started talking,
Yeah.
using an example of Ecuador. So does the Pachamama example in Ecuador give us a potential framework that we can stretch out?
It absolutely does. I mean, I think it gives us the note of how to do this at a domestic level and many other constitutions. I think the fact that it's been able to survive and become something more than token is really important. I think there's a lot written at the international. That's my field of study, is international relations. What we've got now, I think, is how do we rethink the connections between the global and the local? Back in the 90s, we had that glocal word, if any of you remember that, or old enough to remember the glocal. But like, that is the question of our times. Like, we know that we're embedded in our environment and we know how much it matters, but we also know that we're beings that are moving and changing the planet at a global level. We
Yeah.
can't walk this back, right? And we know with the Stockholm Institute and the boundaries, the idea that at the planetary level, we know we have boundaries that we need to live within, and we're blasting through them.
Yeah.
We've gone through 7 of 9 now. How do we do that? Like, I think that's a crucial question.
Who else has a question for Stefanie? David, what's up?
Dr. Stephanie, I mean, I've got to admit that's amazing, and it's an area I hadn't really considered much. But I remember a presentation I saw at the ACT Con in Hanoi recently, and it was about a person with insect traps, like camera traps for insects, trying to map out different countries, low to middle income countries only. If we don't even know what exists out there, how can we act justly? What am I saying here? How can we act justly for that? I didn't word that very well, but I think you get the idea.
Yeah, no, I mean, this, no, I get the idea. I think I sometimes, especially with companion species, and she's a scientist, so lab animals and animals that we use, that if one person picks one thing to care about, you're getting pretty far there. right? Like, so granted, we have a lot of species we don't know about, right? And we haven't discovered yet, but there are probably a lot of people who could, and I think this echoes something with the indigenous mobs here and the totem notions, right? And I know my supervisor for my dissertation's from Guinea on the rainforest side, and his people have a totem system where his family is of the chimpanzees, right? They have a interrelated existence. They help each other. So that's the sort of thing we could think about. We may not know everything, but it doesn't cost us much to care about one thing. That's kind of the feminist ethic in that. And I think it makes decision making at some level more apparent. The question I often get, which is more aggressive, is that, well, what if you had to pick between a dolphin baby and a human baby? And you think, well, we've already done that, right? We already know that we've picked the human baby, right? So let's step back and look at the way in which we could create a world for everyone. And that question is like the ticking time bomb question, right? But it also bears some things that you could probably answer. We've clearly not picked the sun bears, right? Like, or we wouldn't be watching their habitat disappear. And what might it mean in Australia to live inside our own habitat? What if humans question as well, right? But yeah, I know it makes a very complex and often violent human politics. It feels overwhelming, right? So hitting those practical pieces where we can, but as 99 and 100, right? At some point, you might get a cascade of, like if you protect, we know this about keystone species, right? If you protect the koala, like David and Linder here, if you protect the koala, you're protecting the forest. So that means those little bugs that you might not know end up getting protection too, because you're not chopping down the tree because the koala's eating it and the koala's cute and fluffy, and no one cares about the frog, but the frog is going to get left alone, right? Because the koala's charismatic megafauna that we all, though that's becoming problematic too, because we're not very good at protecting them either. Our charismatic faunas are not doing well either.
George, you've got a question.
It's a great question.
Yes, Stephanie. We know it's a multifaceted issue trying to get constitutions changed. Do you have any thoughts on what level we should be focusing on as far as governmental or private enterprise, whatever, or do we need to have a multifaceted approach?
I mean, I think in some ways we do already. We have land courts, we have for justice are different. I think that a really important piece of it is criminalizing behavior. That's what I didn't quite come back to it enough. So thanks for this question. The big piece of it is to say, we're not just going to talk about damages. We're not going to do after the fact, oh, well, you chopped the forest down. Maybe you should, plant a couple trees somewhere else or have carbon offsets. But rather, and Tasmania and Queensland have an easier legal system to work within for criminalizing harm to nature. So we can begin to change and make people criminally accountable for what they're doing, as opposed to just the damage model. So yeah, the criminal and of course, mens rea and intent are problematic in this situation. How do you kind of prove intent for someone destroying a paddock for a golf course, or tearing down trees that were the elephants' habitat, answered by lawyers and people and that's the other thing about the Constitution as well. That's given us ideas and conceptualizations of how legal systems could change. There's a lot of people in the Sydney Uni working on changing laws for property, right? I think, and a great example of this is we don't quite own our children, right? Like we may make them, but we don't get to hurt them. We don't get to, abuse them. We don't get to kill them, even though we're seen as they're seen as our property in some ways. And depending on where you live, that's quite different. But what if we thought about land in that way, right? What if the kind of founding notion of land, then we would have a way in which to say, you're not allowed that anymore, right? Someone else needs to protect it. And the thorny issue with that is we all know that the political systems that we're working within are profoundly compromised. So, like, do you say, well, we want the state to do it? Then you might be like, well, the state's not doing a great job yet. So there's various levels of reform, but I do think criminalization is a big one. You know, you can't just cop a fine if you blow up a sacred cave. And then for these multi-billion-dollar corporations, they just pay. They don't care, right?
Yeah, absolutely true.
Yeah.
Oh, Steph, that's been amazing. Thank you. Now, Declan, you had your hand up momentarily, but then it went down. Did you have a question?
I did. It's somewhat been answered. It's kind of just that thorniness of, I guess, the debt that humans owe to each other, particularly thinking locally of colonization in Australia. And how do we answer that? I guess that has to be answered at the same time that we try to think of multi-species justice, for example, the koala. I think, like, I guess I've answered my own question in my head, but I was thinking in terms of, if we are looking at the fact that whales can talk, and we are possibly on the brink of being able to talk to whales, and that dark time thought of, does that matter? I guess if we can't look after ourselves and we can't face up to that debt that we owe each other, then it queries in my mind, will it matter? And I think the answer I see is to answer it all at once. So to find the justice for each other and the justice for other species kind of concurrently. I don't know if there is
I
other
think you're
thoughts on
absolutely
that.
right.
Thoughts. My
No.
goodness. That's...
Yeah, no, that's, and I think my thinking too is between species can be reflected in the intra-relationships between humans, right? That learning how to treat each other better is also part of learning how to treat all the things around us better. And in fact, in colonization and in continued violence, our more than human companions are often a stand-in, right? Very explicitly, we're threatened. You know, we're going to kill your dingoes and come for you. In the States, there are wolves, right? The Ku Klux Klan put wolves up on crosses all through the Northeast to give a message to the indigenous, the Haudenosaunee there, that, like, we know that these are important to you and we're coming for them too. We know that flying foxes are so close to us and so important to us. And so, yeah, I think, Declan, you've hit on it. I think sometimes we need to know there would be enough love and acceptance for everything played into a lot of places. We do know from, like, that intrapersonal point of view, many people who have who end up hurting humans start with animals. That's quite well known. So if we think about those sorts of ways in which we treat other things and how we turn things into things that don't matter to us in the way that, okay, I'll say this question. I'm babbling a little, but I think this is the key, the heart of everything is that I know that humans objectify things, but why do we think when we objectify them, we can treat them so badly?
Yeah.
Like, that is often the really good question to ask. Like, I know the Dalai Lama says that we treat humans like things and that's where we lost our way, but, like, maybe, like, the horrible treatment of things is also a problem. Like, that we can thingify ourselves a little and put ourselves in these other places, and ask those questions. And that takes a lot of humility. And I think when working with Indigenous politics, a lot of people want to put themselves at the center. So maybe that puts themselves in a place where they could decenter themselves and say, I know things happened, we'll fix it together. Yeah, it's really hard. Like I said, in my darker moments, I wonder where we're going, but I do think there could be enough love for everything on this planet, and I'm not sure where to start that, but I think it's really important.
I think one of the ways is to share it, and thank you so much for sharing it today with us, because I know I've taken pieces of what you said today and they've become part of the way that I will relate with the world, and and the other people around me. So you just do it one person at a time, and one relationship with nature at a time. So well done. Thank you for doing that. It's really important. Michaela has her hand up. I'm going to ask Michaela if you've got a question. We'll go for that as the last question. But I'd also like to give you the opportunity to give us a very brief shout out about what you are doing, the amazing work that you're doing in Africa as well. So yeah, over to you.
Thanks. So first, just really quickly, hi, I'm Michaela Guerin. I'm working with my dad, David, organizing the Global Conservation Tech and Drone Forum in Nairobi on the 2nd to the 6th of March. And I'm the lead organizer of the Women in Conservation Forum, which is a day event on the 2nd of March. And I can put the link in the chat if you want in just a second. My thinking was, how do we bring this discussion into fisheries? Because especially if I assume people here would have seen David Attenborough's Ocean, like the horrific things of how we depend on these whole ecosystems, and we're shooting ourselves in the foot with how we treat it, because then we're not giving our future populations food provision and all the rest of it. So, and then especially with how international legislation functions, how are you meant to protect the, what's your focus? Do you choose the species, or do you choose habitats which we know that they use this area for breeding or feeding or so on? So how can this work?
Sort of basically saying, Michaela, how do we prioritize? Is that sort of where you're
yeah, I think so. It's all so complex. I was just interested as to, do you have any thoughts on how that relates with justice? Because thank you.
I do. I mean, thank you. That's an excellent question, because it brings up another piece that we were just talking about with the other questions, and that's, you have to also criminalize against a particular being, right? Like we'd have to see that one orangutan fighting the bulldozer, that one sun bear that's in that protective custody right now, basically learning how to go back into the wild. That has to be important, as well as seeing the whole species. And you break up I just read something today that was heartbreaking, that they're killing sea lions in the Columbia River mouth because they're killing too many salmon. It's like humans and sea lions. And that's one of the reasons the salmon, so they've been culling sea lions. And you think, I don't know how we're supposed to do this. It feels overwhelming. And frankly, like the ocean, if we didn't have where it eats cod, and it's such an important piece of our food supply, and how much has come out of the oceans, it is shocking. And the fact that we have intelligences down there, like octopuses that apparently use tools and think forward in time, and we eat them as calamari. I don't know, yeah, it feels overwhelming. And you're right about prioritizing, especially at the international level. It's difficult because we have borders, and as the talking about sun bears and elephants, they don't have borders. We don't have borders really, except when we do. You know that the border exists right now in Minneapolis really strongly, right? In America, the border is everywhere, and you can get murdered for it in a second. So we know that's a reality. Yeah, I mean, I honestly feel, what do we have, 17 people here with myself? This is a dang good start. I don't know,
it's a start, isn't it? Yeah.
makes me feel better.
We have gone quite considerably over our hour, and I think it's been worth every single second. So thank you, Steph, so much for sharing all your incredible knowledge and thought processes, because I think it's opened our eyes, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, and the comments and questions were great. So thank you.
We'd love to have you back, even just to listen to everyone else's amazing stuff. Next month, we've got David. David's going to be talking to us about drones in wildlife and wildlife conservation, especially in Africa. That's going to be on February 10th. It will be at 3 p.m. in Queensland, 1 p.m. in Malaysia, and 8 a.m. in Kenya, for those of you that will be in Kenya at that point. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about this idea, and it's something that I hope you'll all be here for, because drones is a way that we can actually fast track some of the conservation efforts that we're hoping to achieve. We can do with technology, and drones is a way that David is looking at achieving some of all our goals. So let's hope we're all there for that one. Please don't forget that this is a free event for any people who are interested in wildlife. Please share the link. When I send you a newsletter, don't be afraid to share that registration link with everyone else you think would like to be here. That'd be really awesome. It would be lovely to see you all here. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next month.